2024 was another packed year for gaming, so much so that only hardcore nerds like myself could tackle all these games in a timely manner. The shockingly high number of quality RPGs alone could keep completionists busy for half a decade, and that's just one genre. With that in mind, this list of the year's top single-player games is supposed to provide a good idea of which titles people might want to catch up on. Of course, like any ranking, this list is subjective, and above all, it's about sharing recommendations, so feel free to leave your suggestions below. This is more of an honorable mention, but I'll keep it here anyway. I still remember the first time I played Sonic Generations. It was one of the first games I had experienced on an HD television, and alongside Resident Evil 5, it was easily among the most impressive looking games I had seen on PS3 and Xbox 360 at the time. Thanks to a strong art direction attuned to the impressive lighting of the so-called Hedgehog engine, it almost felt like laying hands on an interactive animated movie. In fact, some Sonic games that released over a decade later wouldn't look nearly as impressive. Besides that, Generations finally focused entirely on fast-paced platforming with the eponymous mascot, after prior 3D Sonic games, such as Sonic Unleashed, often relied on gimmicky diversions between the roller coaster levels you came for. So it was a bit shocking going back to the original Sonic Generations. In hindsight, it pushed its hardware beyond its limits with some pretty bad stuttering, laughably long loading times, and perhaps most importantly, the controls didn't feel responsive enough for the high speed of the gameplay due to the performance. In particular, the side-scrolling, of which about half of the game consists of, wasn't as snappy as in Sonic Mania or Superstars, which is why Sonic X Shadow Generations made a lot of sense as a remaster, despite not looking drastically improved on the surface. While the main campaign of Sonic X Shadow might look like a simple port, it actually feels much better to play. In fact, playing Sonic X Shadow on a better television with higher resolution and performance was almost as flashy as playing the original for the first time. It's a remaster done right, recreating the game how you remember it, without rebuilding it. I couldn't be further away from being a frames per second counter, but the high speed of Sonic's gameplay demands the controls to react quickly, and playing the new version makes a big difference in game feel. Now, the remaster doesn't change the core formula, and if you weren't a fan of games like this or Sonic Colors before, the remaster won't change your mind. While the side-scrolling sections, which are plentiful, channel the classic pinball-like mechanics, but with a sick new cinematography, the 3D gameplay is all about racing through the highways and roller coaster-like levels in which you need to memorize quick-time events and the timing of homing attacks, while the boosting controls are intentionally a bit floaty. I can't claim that Sonic has the most sophisticated 3D gameplay, especially compared to the side-scrolling, but finding the best routes and all the secrets remains compelling enough. It's often more about spectacle than precise platforming, and there's a reason why I've emphasized the importance of the graphics at the start of this video. While each of Sonic's adventures of the past is represented with one big 3D stage and one big 2D stage, maybe the more engaging part of Sonic Generations are the additional challenges, where short obstacle courses test your skills for specific mechanics. Getting all the unlockables and mastering each challenge is the meat of the game. Some people encountered rare glitches, but they seem identical to the original game, and considering the long history of Sonic Team creating glitchy ports and poor remasters, in this case it can be considered a success that no new problems were found. However, there's one other aspect which makes this remaster quite unique, which is the entirely new campaign featuring Sonic's edgy rival Shadow the Hedgehog. Whereas other remaster or remake projects rebuild rebuild entire games from scratch, Sonic X Shadow Generations presents a potentially more viable and interesting alternative by taking an old game which already has a solid foundation and building on top of it. Super Mario 3D World did the same thing with the so-called Bowser's Fury campaign when they ported the game from Wii U to Switch. There are many classics which don't need full-fledged remakes, which are maybe still unique compared to their sequels, but for which we would have always wanted to have more of. If done right, I would welcome more games being brought back like this, which means by expanding them, not remaking them redundantly. In the case of Shadow Generations, the new campaign does have its own feel too. I'm not just talking about the story and Shadow's character arc, which was Sega's family-friendly response to the edgy, over-the-top anti-heroes of the late 90s and early 2000s, complete with butt rock and lots of melodrama. Also in terms of gameplay, Shadow's movements are snappier and the level design offers more variation thanks to his unique abilities like stopping time and using enemies as projectiles. A few parts feel a little undercooked, like traversing the new overworld, but overall Shadow feels like a perfect DLC which introduces fresh twists while staying in harmony with the base game, except that the original came out over a decade earlier, which again is something I'd love to see for more classic games instead of remakes, like when John Romero makes new levels for the original Doom. But apart from all that, it hits all the right nostalgia points. Generations was all about recreating the most infamous set pieces of 90s Sonic, which at this point has been done ad nauseum, while nostalgia for the now endearingly edgy Y2K era of Shadow and Sonic Adventure 2 has been pretty much neglected up until that point. So here I'll just be a fanboy with rose-tinted glasses, giving in to the simple awe and wonder of seeing those old Dreamcast and PS2 backdrops recreated in HD glory. Besides his platforming and kart racing extravaganza, Super Mario also boasts a long-running career as a role-playing hero, which for many people peaked with Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, which was the second Paper Mario game ever, first released on GameCube in 2004, then remastered on Nintendo Switch a couple of decades later. In theory, most of these games work in similar ways ever since the very first Super Mario RPG on Super Nintendo, which means you traverse small maps full of dungeons, puzzles and villages while engaging in turn-based battles which try to mix traditional menu-based fighting with action commands stemming from Mario's platforming roots. But compared to other JRPGs, the stories were an ironic take on the whole Super Mario spiel, with characters like Bowser and Peach being aware of their own absurdity and cannon fodder like Goombas living ordinary lives. Mario inventor Shigeru Miyamoto is known to really boil down game stories to the absolute minimum, to the point that he forced a slight amount of characterization in Mario Galaxy to be cut out of the sequel. And then infamously he demanded that all unique characters and story elements needed to be cut out of the Paper Mario sequel called Sticker Star. This view is understandable and often needed, because above static storytelling, all games need to be fun interacting with through gameplay. But it's not as universal as someone like Miyamoto would believe. Adventure games and RPGs become much less interesting if you cut out all of their surprise elements or remove more unexpected things the players could discover. Sticker Star felt like an obscure sequence of challenges, less like an adventure game, ultimately leading to maybe the biggest backlash against the Mario franchise ever, when they doubled down on this approach for a direct sequel. Because the original Paper Mario games were already proof that even something like Mario can work with a story. Yes, above all, Thousand Year Door has a very engaging and nicely balanced battle system, which is beginner friendly but also just has enough depth, in particular in boss battles, to be compelling. While the set pieces offer a good variety in puzzle solving and intuitive investigation gameplay. Not counting some of the blatant stretching of game length through backtracking, the original series kept itself fresh with many different adventure gameplay elements. But these things correlate directly with story set pieces and the writing. In the first Paper Mario games, you delve into chapters which are all unique 3 to 4 hour long plots, ranging from conventional JRPG settings like castle dungeons to much more outlandish set pieces like murder plots or Peach philosophizing with a Space Odyssey computer. With that in mind, something like a fighting arena, which would often be a rather ordinary set of battle challenges in other JRPGs, is significantly elevated in Paper Mario by an in-depth wrestling plot, which then becomes a wacky corruption thriller. But even more traditional settings like a deserted treasure island become much more engaging through lots of witty writing and unique characters that are not bound by any franchise guidelines. Compared to later sequels, which weren't allowed to introduce new characters, in the original games you never knew where the journey was going. Anything from Mario's crew being kidnapped by an evil nerd lizard to mafia melodrama was possible. The biggest disappointment when I played Thousand Year Door back in the day was that the mechanics and even progression and puzzles felt very similar to the first Paper Mario. Still, it was a new story, so it felt like it had its place. Now, because Nintendo is Nintendo and they can't help themselves but to always dumb down their old games for remasters, Thousand Year Door on Switch got a new cheat button with which NPCs can practically spoil nearly every step you need to make. While in theory you don't need to press it, it's still so central that it takes quite a bit of wonder out of the investigations. So much so that I prefer the original release, but even that only drives home that the biggest strength lies in the writing and story setups, which are not affected by this kind of handholding. It isn't just the wacky plots and scenarios, but also the dialogue, which finds a perfect balance between irony and surprising wit. If they wanted the Mario movie to not only be financially but also critically successful, the writing of Paper Mario is where they should have taken inspiration. Even if not all scenes are laugh out loud moments, the script always remains a joy to read. Not to mention that this tone perfectly carries over into battle gameplay, which, presented like a stage play, is one big meta gag. Heightened by a great art direction with paper set pieces that feel obviously very cartoony, but still atmospheric, and with lots of inventive character designs, which despite their seemingly simple nature, make for very expressive animations and very distinct appearances. Besides the humorous characters, what sets Thousand Year Door apart is also the more adventurous world building, which features a surprising amount of detail, and I'm not talking about the graphics. There's a huge number of original NPCs which all have little backstories or even their own adventures. Lots of minor characters show up at different places, write you mail and so on. The most prominent example being Luigi, who has his own role-playing adventure in the background. Just the fact that with your research skill you can get small quips on literally every NPC in the entire game makes the world feel alive. This kind of dedication to building up seemingly unimportant characters and optional side locations is rarely seen. Maybe most comparable to some of the Yakuza Like a Dragon games. The main hub world, Rogueport, is actually full of lore and secrets, and slowly delving into its underground depth over the course of the campaign makes for a pretty decent feeling of mystery, on top of the more quirky Mario hijinks. JRPGs sometimes don't have the grandiose writing that you might remember from playing them as a youngster. This is not the case for Thousand Year Door. Its writing is quite timeless. It's aware of its Mario shenanigans, but it's not just slapstick. It's family friendly but not infantile. Ironically, despite what the Miyamotos of this world believe, Thousand Year Door is one of the best Nintendo classics, precisely because of its passive storytelling. Metaphor ReFantazio is an interesting game. You could easily call it a carbon copy of a familiar formula, yet it still feels fresh. When I first got my hands on one of the dungeons in an early demo, shortly after playing Persona 3 Reload, Metaphor almost felt like a fantasy mod for that game. From the turn-based combat in which you gain extra turns by hitting elemental weaknesses down to the controls and animations, whereas the Persona games from the same developers at Atlas mix dungeon crawling and demon hunting with live simulation elements in Japanese high schools, Metaphor keeps the dungeon crawling and time management, but drops the high schoolers. Instead, you're thrust into a war of roses set in a bizarre fantasy land where a giant face in the sky demands that the people name a new king, making you go out and find enough allies in the populace against the traitors. Metaphor shows that sometimes you don't need big gameplay innovations to create a new appeal. The JRPG genre was always very iterative, yet it also remains a story-heavy genre in an audiovisual medium, meaning that shifting the gameplay's context can drastically alter the feel. Having consumed popular media from Japan for decades, I'm simply done with Japanese high school settings. So I was all in for Metaphor. In theory, high fantasy isn't any less trite, but Metaphor isn't your typical fantasy setting. Instead, it's an unusual mix of fantasy, body horror, steampunk, Renaissance art and sketch-like aesthetics with some of the weirdest creatures you can find, featuring an overly bombastic soundtrack. There's also an enigmatic story hook in which the protagonist keeps reading about our real-world political systems and how to get there. But to be fair, while it's refreshing, it also isn't easy on the eye. For example, the UI wants to be as playful as in Persona, but it's not nearly as clean or clear to read. It takes time to make sense of the visuals, especially early on, as the game bombards you with tutorial boxes layered over other visual elements. The horror aspects which come from deformed humans that invade this fantasy anime land also look rather crude compared to other Atlas games like Catherine. Beneath its unique audiovisual identity is a strong and familiar gameplay foundation which can now shine in a different light. Exploring huge dungeons is as engaging as ever, if not better, particularly because the difficulty doesn't pull punches. Customizing your jobs and preparing a diverse party is key to surviving, as well as constantly adapting to new foes with new weaknesses and different attack patterns. I like how very early on the game tells you to sneak by a dragon, but if you decide to encounter it anyway, it's very much possible to defeat it with a good strategy, even if it is much more of a challenge. This approach is emblematic of much of the game, where good strategy can overcome higher level enemies. If you want, you can push yourself deep into a dungeon before retreating and heading back into town, which I always appreciate. And then there's one feature more JRPGs should introduce, which is the ability to slash away weak enemies on the world map before you even enter a battle screen. Additionally, there's a Persona-like timer on all your quests, and each activity or side story advances the clock, as well as traveling to different places. The time management doesn't suit the setting as naturally as a school semester in Persona, but still makes for a decent amount of urgency, at least early on.
Time marches on, and the age of a new king draws nearer.
Now, for all the goodwill, I still have one major gripe with Metaphor. At around 60 to 80 hours, it's simply too big. No gaming campaign needs to last as long as 10 TV show seasons. Not to mention that after a while, it undermines the timer mechanic. Metaphor lets you off the hook sooner than Persona, but it still contains artificial roadblocks that prevent you from continuing the story until a specific date. And because the calendar is so big and the game is so long, it's simply too easy to achieve most of your tasks and then still have waiting time left in which you have to tread water. Similar to Persona, I would have preferred a tighter, shorter campaign where the time management decisions truly impact your character builds and might even incentivize replays. I'm a fan of revisiting games down the line, and even though Metaphor is quite unique, at this kind of volume, it's probably not something I'll ever get back to, which is a shame.
To the rear, I'll use what I must.
Yakuza 7 Like a Dragon was one of the most daring sequels of its year, turning a sandbox action series into a turn-based RPG in an era in which most other games would take the opposite route. Now Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth is all you'd want from a more traditional sequel, because while Yakuza 7 didn't quite nail its first attempt at turn-based combat, Infinite Wealth irons out the majority of its shortcomings. Its predecessor would become quite repetitive once you figured out your preferred combat strategy. But here, a much bigger focus on positioning your characters to utilize your surroundings, party members, and attack range makes for a much more engaging battle system, with more diverse battle scenarios, which on top of that also incorporate the action of prior games in a wonderfully dynamic way, while providing a plethora of customization options, which are very much needed. Because enemy tactics have also become more varied compared to Yakuza 7, where at some difficulty spikes all you could realistically do was to grind. Not anymore in Infinite Wealth, where the right strategy can overcome even more demanding or higher level enemies. Prior Yakuza games, despite technically not being full-fledged RPGs, still felt like role-playing sandboxes. Even more so than other JRPGs because the map was open after each tutorial chapter. A fact that remained true for Infinite Wealth. Nothing can stop you from grinding out a job minigame to buy the best gear in the most expensive store early on, or tackling high-level enemies if you think you've got the right tactics, or the right battle item you might find in a dumpster somewhere. It's also your decision on how you want to build your character stats, be it by befriending people or paying for training courses and being smart with your dialogue options. Infinite Wealth can be handholdy by telling you recommended levels for dungeons and marking side quests on the map, yet it always remains open for you to go a different path or to find different solutions. And exploring the new maps, in particular Hawaii, does pay off, because it has enough interactions, new shops and treasure which you have to find yourself. The only exception being short visits to Japan, where the map and most of its interactions are already laid out, like a Ubisoft game, which is not very interesting from a gameplay perspective, even if the rewards, which are small nostalgic story bits, are kind of nice. Apart from that, you're also always free to go for the series' trademark side activities, like playing in the arcades or watching adult entertainments. And all of them will grow your build one way or the other. With the new backdrop Hawaii, Infinite Wealth all around not only becomes one of the better urban RPGs, but also perhaps the best role-playing game with a vacation backdrop. Because the systems and the scenario go hand in hand. Anyway, Like a Dragon did not just change the combat, but also the tone of the series in general. Before Infinite Wealth, the Yakuza gameplay loop consisted of a few core pillars. A brutal over-the-top battle system, watching melodramatic Yakuza soap opera play out, exploring urban Japan as a kind of virtual tourism, and solving comical side quests. And there was an ironic undertone when these elements sometimes wouldn't quite fit together on purpose. Now that the loudmouth Kasuga has become the center point of these games, they have become even more over the top, if not outright comedic. As Kasuga behaves more like a goofy character from battle manga series like One Piece, compared to series veteran Kiryu, while some of the comedy in prior side content came from the clash between weird sitcom-style setups and Kiryu's stoic attitude, with Kasuga, nothing's out of the ordinary anymore. Side content ranging from fighting sentient monster vacuum cleaners to recruiting confused hobos as your own Pokemon. Minigames not anymore just aiming for virtual city tourism in arcades and karaoke bars, but zany trips like Muscle Man safaris. Battles changed from ridiculously brutal to ridiculously insane, almost turning into a Japanese skit show, because within the story premise, Kasuga is playing his fights out in his head like a child. Yet, Kasuga, as a middle-aged guy losing his job and being harassed by entitled young punks, is still quite more endearing and more relatable than playing yet another high school prodigy or Dungeons and Dragons man. Arguably, the tonal balance of before has slightly tilted. In particular, some of the more serious gangster parts almost feel out of place now, and it's become a little harder to connect to some of the main story plot devices. On the other hand, this approach makes for a more unpredictable game, and considering that the industry has more than enough serious and overly dramatic games, it has become refreshing that a story-heavy open-world title doesn't shy away from outright signaling it's okay to be wacky and dumb because this is a video game. The Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy might go down as one of the most perplexing projects in gaming history. After the beginning point Final Fantasy VII Remake on PS4, the sequel called Rebirth would up the ante quite drastically, boasting a mind-numbing production value to bring the second part of the original 1997 game to life in all new HD glory. A reminder, the first remake barely covered the opening hours of the old PS1 game, which only took place inside the single city of Midgar, where the mercenary Cloud Strife teams up with the vigilante group Avalanche to overthrow the evil Shinra company, which is draining the planet of its resources, while also trying to uncover the secrets around his arch-nemesis, Sephiroth. There is nothing quite like the globe-trotting adventures and cyber fantasy of this series, not last because on the most basic level, no other competitor pours this much budget into their J-pop extravaganza, with Rebirth being a prime example. Traveling the globe to recruit new party members and defeat foes while getting to the bottom of a grand planetary mystery is no longer confined to miniature maps. So the first mind-boggling part of FF7 Rebirth is that they took the abstract concept of an old-school JRPG map and recreated the majority of its settings with the size of a quote-unquote realistic-looking open world, which you can travel with all your classic vehicles. Something like the Gongaga Forest, which was once nothing but a couple of pre-rendered 4x3 screens, has become a full-fledged jungle set piece. And that's just one of many backdrops. Not to mention that besides the old content, there are many additional dungeons and settings. The days of Square Enix excusing the linear corridor design of Final Fantasy XIII by saying that HD towns are hard to make are truly long over. Not to mention that the game boasts a big roster of enemies and boss fights. There might be purists not satisfied with anything but a turn-based combat system, but to me, the FF7 remake has nailed the best of both worlds. While focused on action, it remains essential to issue manual commands for spells and special attacks, ultimately keeping the spirit of the tactics inherent to turn-based JRPGs, while also providing lots of graphical spectacle which requires real-time reflexes, making for something that's more engaging than pure action systems like in FF16. There's quite a bit of repetition in the content of its open world, but let's be real, your typical JRPG miniature map usually felt pretty formulaic too. At the very least, for a Ubisoft-esque tower activating game, the world itself is still good enough in leading you with its environmental design, in particular if you just want to rush to the next story set piece. So it doesn't necessarily feel like following a checklist of icons. Hand-holding has also been toned down a little compared to other Square games, even if it is far from a hardcore dungeon crawler. Unlike FF16 for example, which laid out literally every step with breadcrumbs, in Rebirth, investigating an area actually means investigating an area yourself. And while not nearly all of the new side activities and minigames are home runs, they still make the world feel a little more alive. A good in-world card game can never hurt. For all intents and purposes, Rebirth could be a whole new mainline Final Fantasy game in anything but story. And there comes the biggest crux of the game. Rebirth might have been the most ambitious traditional JRPG at the time of its release, but the story makes it quite inaccessible as a true definitive game experience of this kind. Not only because it's almost mandatory to play FF7 Remake first, which despite a smaller scope is still extremely long. On top of that, this remake trilogy isn't so much a true remake, but a pseudo sequel to the very first Final Fantasy VII on PS1, because Remake introduced new destiny spirits that changed the original lore. In Rebirth, there's a whole new arc stemming from these new elements, which can be suspenseful for people familiar with the PS1 game, but also makes it hard to comprehend to anyone who isn't. Besides that, old characters are introduced in different places of the timeline and impact is lost if you didn't know the old plot. You could argue it goes even so far to rely on your knowledge of the real world perception of FF7, as some of the plot plays with the expectations regarding some of the old twists. Weirdly enough, Rebirth in long stretches also follows the original plotline like it was made for newcomers, but it never quite fits together as a traditionally told story. While this guarantees controversy among fans, if nothing else, it's also quite a bold move. Especially because a traditional remake has been one of the more prevalent wishes in hardcore gaming internet discourse ever since Square produced a graphical Final Fantasy VII HD teaser for PlayStation 3. Yet it would seem that Square Enix saw a false premise in this. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth feels like the most expensive fan fiction ever made, but the fanbase who can really appreciate that is anything but mainstream, despite how beloved FF7 is among a certain demographic. No doubt, the Final Fantasy series paved the way for JRPGs, and FF7 in particular pushed the popularity for the genre and Japanese media outside of Japan quite a lot, as one of the defining and most successful games on the original PlayStation, which in itself ushered in a new gaming mainstream. But 1997 is not 2020 nor 2024 and beyond. At this point, gaming discourse just did not revolve around Final Fantasy anymore, let alone 7. This experiment came too late, and the argument from some developers that the same story all over again would have been boring doesn't make much sense, as the plot is heavily expanded with tons of new backstories, characters, and much more pompous cutscene presentation anyway. Cut out the whole meta-narrative and the remakes would have still been all new, but with that kind of story content in, it's simply less coherent. But make no mistake, the ingredients for a classic new age JRPG are still here. If this game was FF16 or 17 as a self-contained game, it would easily be one of the strongest HD Final Fantasy games. It's just that with its new convoluted Kingdom Hearts tier story structure, it makes its own case a little complicated. Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance promised to be the ultimate version of the formerly Switch-exclusive post-apocalyptic JRPG by Atlus. And in some ways, it is. Most notably, its striking art direction is no longer held back by the original Switch hardware, but fully tuned to modern platforms with tight performance and visual fidelity and almost no loading times. But the original also faced criticism in regards to game design, which Vengeance tried to remedy. The SMT spin-off series Persona has taken on a life of its own, but it's rare for a new mainline SMT game to come out, often dividing core fans, especially because despite sharing the same gameplay foundation, SMT games are usually very different from each other. SMT 5 was the first game to drop traditional dungeon crawling and go for more open sandbox exploration within the demon-infested ruins of Tokyo, which was surprisingly effective. objective. You're still collecting and fusing demons to survive these wastelands, but now it feels slightly freer. Not last because SMT5 did not compromise on the series' high battle difficulty. If you're equipped with a bad team of demons, or if you think you could just grind through small battles in auto mode straight from the start, you will get annihilated and sent back to the main menu like back in the day. There's always one main goal to reach on the map, but how to get there unscathed is up to the player. In fact, constantly fine-tuning your team and developing new combat tactics is as engaging as ever, perhaps even more so than in previous games. SMT is a prime example for turn-based JRPGs done right. It's not about grinding XP points, but to keep customizing your builds to tackle new problems. In turn, you can defeat higher level bosses with the right strategy if you've been smart with your resources. The level design isn't your typical JRPG open zone either. As the game goes on, the city ruins become ever more labyrinth-like, and thanks to a focus on vertical level design, no secret or point of interest on the horizon is as simple to reach as they look. Which is good because many other JRPGs have become too obvious. Besides that, SMT5 nails the vibes when it comes to the audiovisual department. Despite its colorful presentation, it feels anything but lighthearted. The atmosphere of these wastelands is very dense thanks to a surreal art direction and an impressive techno soundtrack. Yet the game remains unmistakably Japanese. It doesn't shy away from boasting a butt rock attitude as well as wacky humor, especially through the zany behavior of the demons. It's even a little jazzy from time to time. In that sense, SMT5, despite looking more sleek and modern, still feels like one of those obscure yet weirdly intriguing Japanese PS2 games that always flew under the radar. By the way, if nothing else, other games should take note of the big PS2-esque fonts this game has. This industry needs to go back to actually readable text. Still, some fans were disappointed with the original release. Despite a strong first impression, the sandbox zones were not as plentiful as the dungeons in other SMT iterations. Other people weren't satisfied with the light story. Vengeance seemed to tackle these criticisms by introducing a whole new campaign, including one big traditional dungeon at the end. However, overall, Vengeance didn't significantly change the original. As is usual with some remasters, sadly, their main focus was to slightly dumb the core design down. You can now save anywhere, which makes traversal more comfortable but also less tense. Reaching a safe spot after multiple hard fights in these wastelands is now less impactful. And I hate to be that guy, but it seems only From Software still understands this. Atlas, on the other hand, introduced a new Navi-type character to highlight more interaction points on the map, making the exploration look even more like a Ubisoft nightmare. Thankfully, as I've already said, the vertical map design still doesn't make exploration too obvious, and you can always turn off the distracting minimap. Out of sight, out of mind works here. As for the story, here's the thing. SMT has always excelled at creating strong vibes rather than excessive storytelling, just giving enough context for its intense dungeon crawling. For me, the bad thing was that SMT5 brought in Japan's tried obsession with high school cringe. SMT always outsourced these high school tropes and waifus into Persona, while the mainline games were more about killing and devouring anyone in your way. In typical Atlas fashion, Vengeance merely introduced new waifus rather than improving the plot. So for an actual director's cut, I would have done the counterintuitive and removed some story. NPC dialogue is still fun enough, but the writing of the main story is painfully cliched and among the worst stories of the main series. Which means that the small amount of cutscenes compared to other JRPGs is to me a feature, not a flaw. SMT5 Vengeance is still a pretty awesome game with an addictive gameplay loop and tight atmosphere, because it still is SMT5 at its core.
Dragon's Dogma 2 is a poster child for open world game design done right.
While the game has been met with controversy, and this video is also gonna get there later, none of it takes away from its main accomplishment, which is that, compared to other games of this kind, the open world isn't just a facade, but a core part of its gameplay DNA. Something that has taken a back seat in the genre, where things like combat and story became more and more prevalent as the main selling points, making some open world games feel formulaic and leaving lots of untapped potential behind, while Dragon's Dogma 2 does not feel like the competition at all. Being chased off your path by a dragon, conquering a cliff in the face of falling rocks, getting lost in a storm where a minotaur might wait for an ambush, and a chimera right after, navigating through a pitch black night afterwards, trying to find a safe spot on the horizon, maybe falling into a griffin's nest or a maze by accident. Now that's a journey. A journey that couldn't be replicated this intensively in a large chunk of competing open world games. First off, Dragon's Dogma falls in line with titles like Elden Ring or Zelda, where the world itself dictates your ways, not map markers or glowing breadcrumbs. The horizon beyond the main path is full of vantage points, which naturally incite curiosity. If it isn't suspicious ruins, cliffs or caves which capture your interest, then it's the picturesque scenery throughout the entire map that simply screams to be explored. It's hard for me to describe how much I dislike vanilla fantasy backdrops like this. And here you also get a rather low-key story and the most generic quest plots you could think of, which makes it a true testament to Dragon's Dogma 2's visual identity, as it never stopped captivating my desire to explore its rich mountainscape. There are some weird story elements, like how the always changing party consists of people who are slaves and happy about it.
Rest assured, Master. You'll hear nary an idle word from me.
And how water is a deadly monster. It seems that these were gameplay elements first, context came later. Now, while a more intense story would have elevated the game even further, ultimately, this focus on game feel is usually a right move. And part of that is also vertical map design. Dragon's Dogma 2 does show you more or less concrete quest locations on the map. The difference compared to some other open world games is that no straight lines lead to each destination. In worse role-playing games, you can sit back, hold the stick towards the marker for a couple of minutes and reach your goal, no problem. The terrain in Dragon's Dogma is not that. Players need to figure out how to traverse these canyons. And while there are main paths, there's no shortage of distractions or alternative ways. Especially because the map is not copy-pasted. Despite its big size, it feels handcrafted. There's no unlimited climbing like in Zelda, but still lots of hidden paths and collectibles found by investigating unique spots or trying to climb tricky platforms. Yet there's still a random factor that can provide the right amount of surprises, like a griffin attacking at the worst times or whatever happened here. Lastly, it's the lack of restrictions that make Dragon's Dogma 2 feel open. From the moment you reach the first big city, you're free to explore the entire map and start questing anywhere. By the time I fully delved into the main quest, I had already unlocked most mechanics and set up a decent transportation network across the map. Conversely, you could miss or just ignore lots of prominent content if that's your style, and finish the game at a refreshing 20 to 30 hours. And this freedom is meaningful because it comes at cost. In theory, mandatory NPCs can die, or you could throw away key items. You will not receive a typical mission failed screen and have to deal with the consequences yourself. Also, the fast travel is limited, so you have to be resourceful with the travel material at your disposal. The game isn't that hard, and there's more than enough warp stones and revival items, but these limitations enhance the feeling of being in nowhere land, especially early on by putting extra pressure on traveling into these uncharted lands unprepared. Conversely, items such as warp stones become satisfying rewards while exploring. It's not like you'll ever be truly lost, but hint mechanics such as oracles still are part of the world. If the game instead guided you through each step with GPS points, player agency would be diminished greatly. At this point, I might as well address the biggest source of backlash against the game, the microtransactions on the store pages, which also contain teleport material. The publisher Capcom is known, despite making great core games, to nickel and dime. From splitting up ROM collections to turning old Resident Evil modes into paid DLC, which isn't even printed on full edition discs anymore. But the microtransactions in Dragon's Dogma 2 do not compromise the game. They are literally invisible. They are never advertised in-game. If it wasn't for internet discourse, you wouldn't even know they existed just by playing the game. Actively seeking them out is like paying money for cheats, but the game itself was not balanced around it, period. Anyway, it's ironic that Dragon's Dogma 2 came out on the same day as Rise of the Ronin, a much more conventional samurai open world game by Team Ninja. When it comes to combat, it's more complex and can be more satisfying than Dragon's Dogma 2. But Team Ninja combat was fine as it was in the more linear and more focused Neo games. Giving it an open map didn't enhance the action, except that the same encounters from before are now drawn out through a kind of meaningless flat lands, sometimes traversable with a glider, which would have also been possible in a non-open game. It's a novelty, but doesn't do anything fundamental with the open world. Games such as this or Assassin's Creed sometimes offer the option to turn off the markers and hints, but then they might not work anymore, because they were often not designed to be quote-unquote explored without handholding. Which is why for games like Dragon's Dogma, despite some surface level flaws, like janky AI or a low level of enemy types for such a combat focused game, it takes lots of craftsmanship to make a game world work on its own like this. Ubisoft did not do its cult franchise Prince of Persia any favors after taking it out of the spotlight for the sake of new brands like Assassin's Creed. When they tried to bring the series back with a lackluster looking remake of the classic Sands of Time, which then entered development hell, the mood among Prince of Persia fans wasn't exactly enthusiastic. So the announcement of a new 2D entry seemingly inspired by indie games instead of the first series game, with a tonally dysfunctional announcement trailer, Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown wasn't met with the biggest goodwill. Which is a shame because, and here's a hot take, on a gameplay level, it could be an easy contender for the best game in the franchise. The back then new type of cinematic platforming introduced by Sands of Time sometimes wouldn't hold my attention too long after the initial splendor wore off. Its particular platforming approach made certain actions feel slightly automated or held within invisible rails, as if the acrobatics were more sophisticated QTEs. Now, The Lost Crown, even as a side-scroller, still features the series' trademark parkouring through ridiculous hallways full of spike traps, except that here players are in full control of all the swift maneuvers, which don't just look flashy, but are just as intense to play, thanks to tight controls, which intuitively provide fluid yet responsive movements from the get-go, both in platforming and in battles. The Lost Crown is following the footsteps of so-called Metroidvania games, especially Hollow Knight, in which you explore a gigantic labyrinth where certain paths only become accessible with unlockable abilities. Yet it's not a tried clone. There are a few Metroidvania tropes. Developers might want to rethink that predictable spiel before getting a double jump. But apart from that, main abilities mostly revolve around different types of teleporting, with the sole purpose of spicing up the platforming, the center of the level design. The number of essential abilities is low compared to other games of the genre, which makes exploring the gigantic map feel relatively natural, because blatant upgrade barriers are comparably few. While branching off the main path is rewarded with not always mind-blowing but at least nice bonuses like improved health and abilities such as fire arrows or slow down counterattacks, or finding bits of lore and secret characters which make the world feel whole. Above all, the parkour-heavy design makes for a raw platforming experience with many creative traps, all attuned solely to testing the player's skill without any fluff. It also contains some puzzle solving, where teleports have to be made in a smart way, creating some pretty inventive head scratchers, which are never too obtuse. similar to the parkouring itself, which is quite demanding but not too frustrating. It has just the right balance for core players. And with little mandatory handholding, the stage and challenge design is almost the opposite of bigger AAA Ubisoft games. Combat feels equally fluid and natural from the moment you pick up the controller. The flexibility of the fighting is almost like a Devil May Cry type game in 2D. Now, compared to platforming, fights might come with a few annoyances, because as good as the controls are, cheap enemy animations can make it feel clunky. Which correlates with the biggest crux of the game. Its low production values are quite apparent and detract from the atmosphere. While its fairy tale backdrops include inventive locations, such as a storm frozen in time, the polygon aesthetics simply don't make for the most atmospheric scenarios, especially compared to other Metroidvania games with a much more appealing hand-drawn graphical style, or Prince of Persia itself with the watercolor look of its 2008 reboot. Lost Crown tries something similar with a Blizzard-esque comic aesthetic, which looks alright in stills, but never comes quite together in motion. It's too bad, because with its superb gameplay flow, if it had a more coherent atmosphere and visual identity, it could have been all around top class for the genre. If you detach the Silent Hill 2 remake from the original version for a moment, judging it as a separate entity, it's undoubtedly a top entry in the modern survival horror genre, following the formula of Resident Evil, in which you explore creepy buildings full of weird puzzles, while you try to clear out your path of monsters with a limited amount of ammunition. Whereas the original Silent Hill drew inspiration from classic Resident Evil, the Silent Hill 2 remake takes cues from the Resident Evil 2 remake. This means a behind-the-shoulder perspective and streamlined menus and save systems. But don't be mistaken, despite the appearance of weird monsters, Silent Hill isn't about biomutant terror like RE. The franchise relies on psychological horror that tries to play with your mind in more subtle ways. Silent Hill 2 follows James Sunderland, who received a letter from his wife Mary, asking him to meet in the small mountain town of Silent Hill. However, Mary has been dead for years.
It's ridiculous. Couldn't possibly be true.
It's a simple but captivating premise that sets the stage for a supernatural and eerie adventure, where the town and its few remaining inhabitants grow increasingly twisted as your journey progresses, and where during the gameplay nothing ever seems quite right. Worlds change around you in subtle ways and play with your reception of this uncanny reality. The remake was developed by Bluebird Team, which was new to the franchise, but some direction still came from original composer Akira Yamaoka and original art designer Masahiro Ito. And without a doubt, their particular art has rarely been portrayed with so much impact. The only minor blemish is the garish red used to indicate low health. But ignoring that, the eerily uncanny, slowly decaying townscape and its surreal chasms have never been so detailed, and Ito's twisted creature designs have never felt so intimate.
Yeah, I'm looking for Silent Hill. Is this the right way?
But what stems the atmosphere the most might be the sound, in particular the music by Yamaoka, including both remixed songs and entirely new tracks.
Boys, you could be
My name is Maria.
Which all feature his trademark style, where the sometimes jazzy and sometimes somber songs have a surreal underlying tone, as if you heard them through an echo in a hall. Equally eerie is the ambient soundscape, where elements like wind chimes blend seamlessly with the music. It's a game with some of the best sound design in its genre and should really be played with headphones on. As mentioned before, on the surface, Silent Hill 2 follows the horror remake style popularized by the hugely successful Resident Evil 2 remake. Now, I will always defend that game against criticism claiming that it supposedly cut too much content from the original version because it was clearly a new interpretation altogether, with different map layouts and campaign designs, which also brought in many elements not present in the prior version. However, it was clear that a couple of ideas from old RE2 were not adapted into this new interpretation because maybe the budget was running low. The Silent Hill 2 remake avoids such criticism entirely. It still is its own interpretation, but also feels closer to the original layout. Literally no plot point, puzzle or gameplay element is missing. To the contrary, it includes all the locations, mechanics, the same continuity, songs and story endings from the original, while also adding new locations that feel like a natural extension of the old design. There's entirely new rooms and puzzles, and none of them would have felt out of place in old Silent Hill. In fact, all the puzzles are engaging, even when they require you to sit back and think for a few minutes. Some elements have also been built upon elegantly, such as this coin riddle, which now tells a longer story players have to react to. As you might know, you can divide Silent Hill 2 into 4 core areas within the town, and the original game took about 8 to 10 hours to finish, which I consider the ideal playtime for this genre. If I had a criticism of the Silent Hill 2 remake, it would be that at around 15 hours, the new puzzles and rooms might make it feel a bit too long. As much as I enjoyed exploring most of the areas, once you finish the third one, which is the Labyrinth, to me it felt like it peaked. At this point you feel the most lost and entrenched in the insanity of the town, including intense boss encounters and important plot lines concluding. After the Labyrinth I was ready to wrap it up, but of course, since this follows the original layout, you still have another big mansion ahead of you where the puzzle and enemy variety starts to wear thin. Other classics like Resident Evil 1 and 2 also stopping at the 8 to 10 hour mark feels just about right, because keeping the high tension beyond that is hard to pull off. But apart from that, the Silent Hill 2 remake retains the survival horror spirit it's based on, with diverse set pieces and level design. The default mode, which I very much recommend, doesn't treat you like a stupid person. Beyond combat, Silent Hill 2 feels like an investigation game. There are no glowing breadcrumbs or GPS points holding your hand. There are no NPCs to tell you puzzle solutions, and yes, you will be stuck from time to time, which is not a bad thing. Navigating some of these labyrinths and puzzles can feel briefly hopeless, which is exactly the feeling you want in a game like this. In reality, there's never a moment where the solutions are truly out of reach. Even the game's version of yellow paint is non-intrusive. It marks interaction points in an elegant way without taking the exploration away from you, unlike so many other games of this era. I insinuated that stressful combat against biomutants like in Resident Evil wasn't really in the DNA of Silent Hill. With the Silent Hill 2 remake, it actually is, and that's not bad. Enemies will attack you much more aggressively, and at the same time you have a lot less ammo. You truly have to be careful with each shot, eventually resort to tactical melee attacks and keep an eye on your surroundings. Whereas in prior games you could run by many of the enemies, which ironically was nothing to complain about, because the combat controls of old were quite cumbersome anyway. But that kind of gameplay flaw wouldn't really fly in a game from 2024. One key component of the franchise is that the radio will signal nearby enemies through static noise, but the Silent Hill 2 remake is the first time it truly makes you anxious for what's behind the corner. Not to mention that bosses are much more sophisticated and relentless when it comes to combat patterns. All in all, this remake makes for one of the more terrifying visits to Silent Hill, which is saying something. Astro Bot as a franchise feels like an anomaly. When you've been playing video games long enough, it's easy to become cynical because you think you've seen it all. Yet the first time playing Astro's rescue mission for the PS4 VR was quite mind-blowing, and I was not alone in comparing it to the feeling of the first time playing a 3D sandbox game like Mario 64 back in the day, as Astro featured a whole new dimension of gameplay. Admittedly, my time with a few showcase levels didn't convince me to buy a VR set, as it still felt too niche and cumbersome to manage at home, but it left me hoping that perhaps, even with more traditional means, the Astro IP could provide the same surprise in a more accessible way. It did so somewhat with the pre-installed Astro's Playroom on PS5, which fully embraced the new features of the controller. But let's not beat around the bush, despite its high quality, it still felt like a tech demo. But then followed a full-fledged release called Astro Bot. And surprisingly enough, it delivered almost everything you could hope for. There are many things you could attempt to be snarky or cynical about, but ultimately you'd look like a tryhard. When I started Astro Bot, I thought I knew what was going on. The save files are PS1 memory cards, social media was flooded with cameo appearances, and after starting the game, it had the exact look and feel of Playroom. Thinking this must be more of the same, but with nostalgic references to distract from that fact. Well, that impression doesn't last long. Not often are there games that are this jam-packed with gameplay ideas. Over the course of 7 to 9 hours, it often feels like no minute is the same, with a plethora of creative set pieces, power-ups, and over-the-top boss fights, and almost no elements repeating themselves. What's particularly striking is that the game doesn't waste time. Where other games slowly build up mechanics or hold some features back for later, Astro goes crazy with an idea straight from the start. For example, when Astro transforms into a metal ball to traverse spiky floors and tunnels, the game doesn't stop there. In the same level, you'll quickly be crushing other metal objects, catapult Astro as a golf ball, make much more devastating jumps on trampolines, or clog up volcanoes and giant vacuum cleaners. And then the next level is something else entirely. Astro's moveset is no competition for the flexible acrobatics of Mario, but the game makes up for it by fully embracing the functions of the PS5, where the sophisticated rumble, shoulder button rebounds, and sound effects within the controller react differently to different situations. Rolling over hard ground literally feels different to traversing sand. Ripping a switch out of the ground with the rocket chicken literally feels different to shooting through glass with the rocket dog. It's hard to describe in a video just how satisfying these haptic features are while punching through Lego blocks or pulling a giant zipper. Astro fulfills one of the most important aspects of a platformer, which is to make the mere act of moving around and interacting with the world engaging. The game may try a little too hard to be quirky and cute, and I'm not the biggest fan of the sterile aesthetic where everything organic is made out of plastic or metal similar to Mega Man. To me, the overall identity of this Astro world could be stronger, but to be fair, if I played this as a child, I might just look at it the same way I now fondly look at the self-referential world building of 90s platformers. Considering how hard the game tries to be cheeky, it's hard not to be at least a little amused. Now, when it comes to references similar to something like Mario Odyssey or Sonic Mania, they are merely a nice icing on the cake. I certainly chuckled at some of the deep cuts that the game offers for long-time gamers, and if the nostalgia bait sold a few more copies, keep going with that. But to be clear, if you do not recognize a single reference in this game, it doesn't change anything. The majority of references is relegated to the costumes worn by some of the level collectibles, which would still work the same way without the cosplay. They are in no way the main appeal, which is still the platforming. Astro Bot is not the Family Guy of games. Initially, I wanted to note that the game followed the Mario style of 3D platforming, where obstacles take a back seat in favor of wacky gameplay features, where the surprise moment of Mario turning into a bee or something is more important than a difficult platforming challenge, which isn't a bad thing, but just not my preferred style. In the case of Astro Bot, it would be the wonder of watching this mascot transform into a giant sponge, or fighting the big Donkey Kong fight that Nintendo never dared to make. However, Astro Bot isn't just about the gimmicks. Beyond the main levels are quite a few parkours that are all about a fast-paced platforming challenge. And you actually need to finish at least a few, since the final boss requires around 2/3 of all collectibles. Also, the supposedly short playtime of 7 hours for veterans isn't a negative either. It's harder to make a game tight and still feel like a full adventure at this length, and Astro does so by not wasting any time to introduce a higher amount of ideas than many games that are 3 or 4 times longer, which left me with a game with nothing to realistically complain about, despite my lofty expectations for the IP. It almost felt symbolic that such a creative and tightly focused game was released in 2024, a year when many studios were shut down and big publishers, including Sony, released multiple flops that were all about chasing trends and nickel and diming consumers, the opposite of Astro Bot.